Okay, hi everybody from Tel Aviv University. Welcome to the webinar called The State of the World When Peace Returns to the Ukraine. This webinar is co-organized by the Boris Mintz Institute for Strategic Policy Solutions to Global Challenges and the International Graduate School of Social Sciences, or IGS3 as we like to call it. These two bodies co-organized a new forum called the International Club. It's an open forum with top minds currently active in diverse disciplines, whose aim is to fill the void in practical reason regarding the welfare of society. And the war in Ukraine, as we know, is a global challenge and a global event by any scale, whose ripples affect many, many aspects of our lives, political, economic, environmental, and others. And so today, at the first meeting of the International Club, we want to discuss the issues of the post-war era, and we wish that we will arrive at this point sooner rather than later. To this end, we invited several of the world's leading minds to discuss the various aspects of the topic. And without further ado, I'd like to invite Professor Itai Sened, the Dean of our Faculty of Social Sciences, the head of the International Graduate School of Social Sciences, and the Boris Mintz Institute to open the discussion and deliver his opening remarks. Itai, please.
Okay, thank you, Ayelet, for the introduction. The idea of this club is to, as Ayelet mentioned, bring the top minds to think of what we all should be thinking more of. The Boris Mintz Institute was created to deal with global challenges, and there seems to be no greater global challenge right now than the war in Ukraine. And we owe a debt of gratitude to Boris Mintz himself for keeping all of us kind of with the eyes open on the most challenging topics, something he has insisted on ever since the creation of this institute. And today we have really 5 of the top people, probably the top people, who can give us some ideas as to how we want to think about it that is clearly going to be different than the common discussion that is often off topic and actually off the fact. So without further ado, I'd like to ask Shlomo Ben-Ami to open the discussion with his remark. Shlomo Ben-Ami has been the foreign minister of Israel for some time, a renowned historian of war and other things, war and peace, and has worked on many such topics, including most recently dealing with a conflict in Colombia that he has had a very significant role in bringing to some peace or something close to peace. So I would like to address Shlomo with 2 basic questions. Is first of all, how do you bring such conflicts to an end? And what might be the road to overcome the distrust that is created? I know you work on Colombia and what you've been doing there. How do you overcome the distrust created during these conflicts so that people can live after them in some sort of peace? You are on mute, Shlomo. Shlomo, you have to.
Yes. Okay. My humble experience, both in government and elsewhere, is that trust is overrated as a component of peacemaking. The question is respect. The question is if you respect your opponent, your interlocutor. If you look at our case in Israel and the Arab world, we respected Assad. And we were really, we were willing to give him the entire Golan Heights, even without having met him. Rabin didn't meet him, and they made this deposit. But we do not really respect the Palestinians. So the question is not one of trust, is one of respect. Now, in order to address the possible outcome of the war, we need to understand its origins. Of course, the origins do not necessarily vindicate the reckless behavior of Vladimir Putin, but he has some sort of a point. The fact that NATO expanded into the gates of Moscow was not exactly conducive to an understanding with a fundamentally revisionist Vladimir Putin, nor was he the first person in post-Soviet Russia to have this kind of attitude. In fact, the so-called Primakov doctrine spoke about the need to recover the lost Soviet empire. Also, Ukraine has an undeniably acute problem of dual identity. That was not invented by Putin either. The fact that Ukraine had an initial constitution when it declared independence in 1991, the constitution was neutral, was about neutrality. It was because of the change of the constitution that you had the rise of Yanukovych, and then he later was ousted by the Maidan protest. So I think that Yanukovych was not an accident. He was the reflection, he was the expression of this division in Ukraine. Obviously, the war has helped galvanize Ukrainian nationalism, as it happens always in wars of occupation, as from Napoleon in Germany to Israel in Palestine, and now in Ukraine. But this doesn't deny, or it doesn't belie the fact that a solution would have to be found to the dual identity. The Minsk agreement, the Minsk II agreement, spoke about a federal Ukraine. I sense that Putin should not be allowed to retain any territorial gains that he made in this war of occupation. But I believe that Crimea is a different matter. I think that it will be extremely difficult to get back Crimea to Ukrainian sovereignty. It was handed over by Khrushchev in 1954 as a commemoration of an agreement of 1654 that expressed the unity between Ukraine and Russia. Ukraine was never part of the of the Western orbit, as it were, and hence I guess that if you conduct in Crimea a referendum, not like the one that is being now conducted in the Donbass, you will find that most of the population would support being part of Russia. So it was essentially is different than the problem of Eastern Ukraine. I think that West needs to ask itself one fundamental question: what is the end game? And the West doesn't have a united vision as to the end game. To begin with, Europe is deeply divided. There is a difference between Central Eastern Europe that is closer to the problem than Western Europe, where you have the Spaniards, the French, the Italian, particularly now in Italy with the new government. The problems of the Sahel, the problems of immigration, the problems of North Africa. This is what matters essentially to Eastern Europe to Western Europe. The UK is a different question. We'll see how they behave now. I guess they will continue the line that was taken by Johnson. The UK is essentially a country with a militarist tradition, or the military tradition. It's not the case of other Western countries. And the Second World War, not unlike in Russia's case, is a sort of surrogate religion. I mean, the Battle of Britain, and et cetera, et cetera. And if we want to understand the balance of power in this war, it goes beyond the battlefield, because this has become, for all practical purposes, a world war, where every corner of the planet is affected. The economy put in inflation. It started obviously before, but it accelerated with the war in Ukraine. And he has the support, the views, the anti-Western views of Putin are not his monopoly. You find them in Africa. You have a process of Finlandization in East Asia, with about 11 countries in East Asia that abstained in the UN vote, and they, because of fear of China. I think that the analogy that I can find between this war and some war and that was, that helped resolve the conflict in the past, the best analogy to my mind is the Yom Kippur War between Israel and Egypt. So you have a war between two parties, with the United States participating with massive supplies of weapons to one of the parties, which is what the Americans are doing now and NATO is doing now with Ukraine. And then you have the fact that you had an oil embargo in 1973 in the Yom Kippur War that affected the behavior of international stakeholders. And you have another similarity, which is quite striking, is the fact that the US intervened in the war in 1973 by supplying weapons and supporting the Israelis, etc., among other reasons because it wanted to use the war as another, and as yet one more instrument to dismantle Russian hegemony or Soviet presence in the Middle East, which eventually it achieved that. The Yom Kippur War was essential in getting rid of Russian presence in the Middle East. Now, the same can be said about Ukraine. I mean, the war, the fact that Americans don't have yet a clear endgame has to do with the ultimate intention to deter China in Taiwan and in the South China Sea, but they don't know where to stop. The fact is that China is quite lukewarm in its support of the Russians right now. They are not very happy with the fact that the Russians are dragging them into a confrontation with the international community, because unlike the Russians, the Chinese are part of the global economy. They have more items than just gas and oil to export globally. So I think that when Biden, quite at the beginning of the war, said that he is concerned by the fact that that the Russians, or that Putin doesn't have an exit strategy. And the question is, Mr. Biden, what is your exit strategy? Is this just dismantling, weakening the Russians, getting back to the international border? This will not happen. With all the flaws of the Russian military, and they are quite striking. I think that the Americans need, and NATO and the West needs to start thinking on the day after, to conceive an end game which is reasonable, which is perhaps even mutually unacceptable or mutually unsatisfactory, which is the kind of settlements that normally hold. So I think that the question of Crimea will have to be resolved separately from the Minsk II agreement. The Minsk II agreement needs to be implemented. That is, that some sort of federal structure, constitutional structure. Zelensky has already said quite at the beginning of the war, and it is remarkable that Putin did mention this in last week. He mentioned Zelensky's March 2022 peace proposal, where he spoke about neutrality and the territorial issues to be deferred to a later stage. So I think that within this framework, where you go back to Minsk, where you leave open the territorial issues that are under dispute and perhaps resolve them at a later stage, I believe that Crimea needs to be resolved with an authentic, internationally perhaps supervised referendum, and then keep Ukraine as a buffer state, as a neutral state, as the 1991 constitution, the Ukrainian 1999 constitution has it. So I think this is my last point, Itai. This would have to be wrapped up, I believe, with by addressing the issues that started the war, and that is the European security architecture. There, I mean, try to revise together with the Russians, how can a revised, a reshaped security architecture secure the equilibrium in this part of the world. A Russian defeat, which is what it seems to me some in the West expect, is, in my view, as damaging as a Russian victory. To have a humiliated Russia, the largest territorial empire in history, with the largest arsenal or nuclear arsenal, with a group of coup makers that oust Putin and do not get any kind of compensation for Putin's aggression. Having this kind of frustrated giant in the heart of Europe, I don't think that this can really secure stability for years to come.
Thank you, Shlomo. We really appreciate this. And I think that you have, toward the end, touched on one of the most interesting development of this conflict, and that is the coming up, or the coming of age, or the coming together, however one wants to call it, of the European Union, and a group that has so far remained quite cohesive. And this is the area of expertise of Simon Hicks. So sitting with us, this is a great opportunity to thank the EUI for hosting both Simon and me for this event. Also, a good place to mention that the next event is most likely to be hosted by Sciences Po in Paris. Simon, so how well are we doing so far as the European Union is concerned? And where do you see the challenges that the Union is going to face as this war drags on?
Thank you, Itai. Thank you for the invitation. Fascinating comments there by Shlomo. I'll try and address some of those in what I'm going to say. What I always say to my students, I've been teaching EU politics for 25 years, is never underestimate the ability of the EU to find a way to muddle through. And I think at the beginning of the crisis, the latest crisis for the EU, everybody was saying, this is the crisis that will end the EU, or this is the EU will never be able to deal with this crisis. And of course, the EU comes out of this crisis, as it often does with crises, strengthened by the experience. They came into the crisis, of course, with very, very different geostrategic interests and geostrategic relationships with Russia, whether they were security type relationships or historical relationships or financial or energy relationships. If you think about Germany and Italy, really having historically much closer relations to Russia. Of course, Germany and Italy both very dependent upon Russian gas in particular. And the contrast with France, for example, with its nuclear energy, or the UK with its own 50% of its own gas supply, and the UK having gone through very difficult tensions with Russia over the last decade. The UK no longer, having left the EU, Putin was in favor of the UK leaving the EU, wanted the UK out of the EU because he felt the UK was one of the blocks inside the EU that made it difficult for Russia to have positive relations with the EU because of the UK's position. And then you have Central and Eastern Europe divided between Poland and the Baltic states with very strong anti-Russian sentiment amongst their publics, very strong anti-Russian interests, very worried about, are they next after Putin sends his tanks into the Donbass, and the Baltic states in particular very worried. Orban, who is then stuck, and a big split emerging between Poland and Hungary on what to do about the war. What is remarkable is, despite that description, despite those conflicting interests, despite those different dimensions of conflicts, the EU agrees a very common sanctions regime, coordinates its sanctions regime with the United States, ratchets those sanctions up, successfully ratchets them up, agrees to rearm the Ukraine, yes, led by the US and the UK, but following on very much. The EU agrees common coordinated action on dealing with Ukrainian refugees and the sort of financial packages that need to be put in place to support member states that are dealing with those refugees. So any one of those issues. We also talk about energy security, which is now coming, where the EU coordinating energy supply, coordinating how the EU is going to divert itself away from reliance, particularly on Russian gas. And after the Nordstream pipeline gets turned off, how is the EU going to share energy supply across Europe and use what it can do to support the member states that are very much dependent on energy from Russia? So it's quite, the EU has come quite a long way. Within the EU, with Germany, it's had a transformative effect on Germany. Germany was, of course, a neutral power, and Germany is now emerging as a military power on not just in the European stage, but I think this will have implications on the global stage. Germany will no longer be dependent on Russian gas. Germany is now turning away from what was the policy. Germany, in a sense, within Europe and within the world, was leading the Russia away from nuclear power. And now is realizing that perhaps the strategic interests of that, it's not just about your own, it's not just about climate change and addressing climate change and clean energy. There are geopolitical aspects of energy policy that were not really taken into account. It had become very reliant on Russian gas, of course. The policy has really changed very much. They look across the Rhine to France and see that France is now probably looking the best when it comes to energy security and energy supply in Europe because of France's heavy dependence upon nuclear power and its own domestic production of nuclear power. It's not to say that, we're now back to fossil fuels or there's going to be a complete change away from pro-environmental energy policy in Europe. I think it's a more realistic energy policy in Europe, where the goal is to get to clean energy and ramping up alternative energy sources from wind power, wave power, other types of hydroelectric power, and so on. But rather than relying on gas as the interim to get there, to rely on nuclear power as the interim before we get there. And I think that's a quite clear shift I think we've seen in Europe. France was split. Germany and France are on two sides of that debate. And now I think they're more or less on the same side on that debate. And I think that's going to be the drive for European energy policy because of the geopolitical interest. So if I were to point to one long-term consequence of this, I think it is the Europeans' attitude towards energy, and it's not wanting to be reliant on Russian gas, and a change in strategy internally within Europe. Overall, I think the EU so far has come out pretty well from the crisis. I think several aspects of European integration, not just energy, but also defense, and the way the EU is emerging as, in a sense, the defense pillar, the European pillar of NATO. And particularly when we think about how Finland and Sweden, if they end up being part of NATO, it basically, you can see how the EU really increasingly takes on a defense aspect to it, led not just by France, but now led by France and Germany, that covers all, so this is another fundamental shift in what the EU represents. So the public as well, we've seen a shift in support for the EU as a result of this. We saw a decline in public support for EU over, around about a decade ago after the financial crisis. We've gradually seen an uptick in support for the EU. The Commission, I think, has come out very well. Von der Leyen, I think, has been boosted very much by this process. And I think the EU actually, at the beginning of the crisis, you would have said this is the end. This is a real disaster, real fundamental existential crisis for the EU. And I think we're now looking at this and saying the EU has actually survived very well. I'm just going to put two buts here. One, of course, is the Italian election that we just saw. And we don't yet know which way a Meloni-led government in Italy will go. On the one hand, Meloni herself and her party has not been pro-Putin despite where it's coming from ideologically. And this is partly because it's a relatively new political party, so was not sort of bankrolled by Russian money, unlike Lega or Forza Italia. So, but she's in coalition with Lega and Forza Italia. And we don't yet know which way this government will go. She is already, she's towing a line. What she's saying rhetorically is that she will not challenge the European position. She is opposed to Putin. She's in favor of sanctions. She wants independence from Russian gas temporarily. That's where she is right now. But I think there's big uncertainty there. And the other one, of course, is the uncertainty of how long the war drags on and what that means for European energy policy. If we get into the winter, and it is cold in much of Europe in the winter, unlike in Israel, we will have European governments saying to their citizens, you have to turn down your heating. We can't afford this. We can't afford to subsidize energy anymore. Europe is hoping the war gets resolved before winter really kicks in, because I'm not sure the long-term sustainability of European energy policy without at least some supply of gas from Russia. I think that was the worry is European public opinion will start to change quickly in this situation. If given a choice between, do we want to carry on sanctions to Russia or do you want cheap energy? In the middle of deep winter in Europe, I think European citizens will start to get soft on that question.
So this is really working nicely because Shlomo kind of handed it over, making some remarks about the European Union. And now Simon has made some remarks on energy in Europe. And we have the best, probably global expert on energy in Europe with us in Professor Miranda Schroers, who has pretty much dedicated her career to this issue. So Miranda, where are we going with? Because the second challenge, if we look away from the Ukraine conflict for a second, the second most pressing challenge is, of course, global warming. Miranda has been working on this for many years now and has been engaged with European energy policy for the last decade or so, quite heavily. So Miranda, where are we going with all of this?
Yeah, thank you so much, Itai.
How cold is the winter going to be here?
Well, it's I'm in Italy right now, in northern Italy, and the first signs of snow are here in the mountaintops. So thanks to both of the previous speakers, Professor Abe and Professor Hicks. I enjoyed both of your presentations, even though I don't completely agree with both of them. And that's always what makes for some interest when we have a panel discussion. I actually prepared a few slides, and I'm going to share my screen, and then certainly am more than happy to open up with any kinds of questions that might come up from it. And what I would like to do here is just give you a little bit of an understanding of how things have changed in the 8 months or so of this year, from when the war had not yet started to now, end of September. And what we know is that European Union was indeed very dependent on Russia, especially for its gas, getting over 40% of its gas from Russia, but also a very large percentage of its coal and about a quarter of its oil from Russia. The big change has been that we are no longer so dependent on Russia. Gas imports from Russia as of today within the European Union are down to 8%. The storage capacity has been filled much faster than was originally expected. So we're at 91% full capacity in terms of our gas storage. And our gas use is actually been below average, except for the last days when it's been pretty cold in Europe. So we have seen actually a drop in gas use in Europe of about 8 to 9%. So the reaction to the war has been pretty dramatic already in the European context. What you see here is looking at that kind of question a little bit more specifically January until August. And here you can see that there has been some change in terms of what we're importing. There has not been much change in terms of what Russia has been earning from our fossil fuel imports. And that reflects the higher gas prices, the higher oil prices in the last months. So the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia have not had the impacts that was initially expected, although we are seeing those impacts perhaps much more when it comes to high-tech sectors. And what we're also starting to see now with the newest complete import changes coming in, that we are having less of a revenue traveling to China, especially in the area of oil. I see that this PowerPoint didn't work, so I'm going to skip it and move on to the next one here. The gas pipeline network connecting Europe to Russia is intense. That gas line pipeline is also important because European countries are connected to each other as well. And one of the things that we have seen is with the reduction of gas flowing from Russia to Europe, that we are using the pipeline network much more to interconnect among European countries. The big change, of course, started with the Nordstream 2 pipeline and the decision not to certify this pipeline. The Nord Stream 2 pipeline runs parallel to the Nord Stream 1 pipeline. And you all have heard the last day or two that there's been sabotage on these pipelines, and there are some pretty intense gas leaks happening right now in the Baltic Sea area. We still don't know who is behind the sabotage, but it's pretty clear that it was planned, given that there were 3 explosions at the same time on these pipelines. Oh boy, something isn't just working here. What we can see with the imports and changes, the coal embargo has gone into effect as of August. And so European coal imports, which were 45% coming from Russia, are now down to 0. And this has hurt Russia. Russia's coal exports have declined. Other countries have not been buying up the coal that Europe is not importing. Oil embargo is coming into effect at the end of this year, with some exception for Hungary. But essentially, by the end of this year, Europe will no longer be importing oil from Russia. Some of this oil is now moving to other regions of the world. Very important is that Russia's war has led to new energy policy in Europe when it comes to energy efficiency as well as renewable energy. The efforts to reduce dependency have led to a big push on energy efficiency, and we are starting to see some positive impacts here. It's everything from energy savings, where in many European countries, efforts to light up cities at nighttime, or to have monuments lit up. This has changed so that we're trying to save energy here. But perhaps more importantly, the technical changes that are happening are leading to some significant improvements in how energy is used. Also very important is that Russia's war is leading to a speed up on renewables development in Europe. And here we're seeing revisions of the Renewable Energy Policy Act, with Germany, for example, now planning to get 80% of its electricity from renewables by 2030. It currently is a little over 50%, and it's expected to have 100% by 2035. So this is leading to a very, very rapid expansion on plans for especially offshore wind development. Yes, some of what's been was coming to Europe is now being shifted over to Siberia and China. So we're seeing pipelines that are being developed now to take some of the gas from Siberia down into China. But this, of course, will take time, and it's not going to be a replacement for all of the exports that were going to Europe. So the long-term impacts are not only on Europe, they're also very much on Russia. And it's very clear that Russia, which is so heavily dependent on fossil fuel exports, is going to be hurting for decades because of what is happening now. And it goes further than that. It's also the developments with the Biden administration, which rejoined the Paris Climate Agreement when he started in office, the infrastructure bill, which was passed in the United States as a bi-party bill between Republicans and Democrats, which is also going to be a big push on a clean energy transition. And most recently, the Inflation Reduction Act, which actually could be also called the Climate Act, because a lot of what's in this policy is addressing the development of renewable energy and electric mobility infrastructure, grid infrastructure. So changes in the European energy structure are also being seen with some changes happening in the US energy structure. But something that was mentioned in the earlier presentations, which I think is interesting to look at, is on the climate change front. The United States and China were very important in terms of pushing forward action on the Paris Climate Agreement. And that led eventually to this US-China joint statement on climate and the development of US-China cooperation on climate, which has in the meantime been put on ice because of Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. So I just wanted to say that what we did hear about developments between the United States and Russia and the United States and China do seem to be very much linked. So certainly the foreign policy of the United States and the foreign policy of China are coming into big play here. So a pessimistic view on what is going on would suggest that the war is really having a very big impact. We're running out of time on climate change, and yet and yet Europe is returning to the use of coal because of the war on the Ukraine. We're seeing that China is doing the same. There's a bit of a souring of cooperation with China. So we could see that what is happening with the war is also going to have some very serious negative impacts on other issues, including climate change. But the more optimistic view is that what we're seeing now is a speed up of an energy transition in Europe away from fossil fuels. And probably we should say that the war in the Ukraine is the single biggest push we have seen in a very, very long time for this transition. And I do have to disagree with Professor Hicks on the nuclear question. Germany is not shifting its views on nuclear because of what is going on. Germany has decided it will keep 2 of its nuclear power plants in a reserve capacity through April of next year, but then is still planning to shut them down. And actually, France was in big trouble this year because they didn't have enough water to cool their nuclear power plants, and they had to shut about half of them off and get electricity from Germany. So I'm not so sure that the views on nuclear are really changing there. But what I do agree with very much is that we're seeing a deepening of European cooperation and a deepening of appreciation of the European Union because of this war. We're also going to see much deeper cooperation between Europe and the United States, in part because of the war and in part because of the climate change situation. But we do see that the implications of this war are bigger than just the relationships between Russia and Europe or Russia and the United States. The whole spill-off in terms of messages being sent to China are also very important. And this too is going to impact what is going on. I do hope that in the end that a terrible war does at least lead us in a better direction on dealing with the other big problem out there of climate change. So I'll stop my presentation here and come back to all of you.
Thank you so much, Miranda. So the next speaker is of course Paul Romer, and very known for his statement that one should never waste a crisis. So how do we not waste this particular crisis, having started in so many ways by the complete dysfunctioning of economic and political institutions that you have been so critical of for many, many years. So you're right on that one. But now the question is, what do you do now, and how you have been so much associated with the idea of the human mind being able to overcome crises and challenges. This one seems to be awfully big. So please give us some optimism on that one.
Well, thank you. There's been a number of very interesting suggestions and comments so far. I could spend my entire time just reacting. Let me start with some reactions and then turn a little bit more towards the question you asked, Itai. First, I think this question about what the effects are on climate is huge. I think this has been a big shock, and a bit in line with your kind of this saying about, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. This shock has opened up, I think, the discussion about climate change. It's focused some action. I think the single biggest unresolved question is the one that Professor Schurz and Professor Hicks addressed about nuclear power. I should say that my personal view is that it's been just a tragic mistake that the world has not invested more effectively in nuclear power. This is the best way to address the problem of baseload supply of energy, supplemented, of course, by renewables. And there's very little prospect that storage is going to get to the point that it solves our baseload problem. So nuclear power is almost certainly going to be an important part of a decarbonized energy system. It's just tragic there's been so little investment in nuclear power so far. I hope Professor Hicks is right, but he may not be, that attitudes are shifting. I think at least attitudes are, the question is now being asked about whether perhaps trying to shut down nuclear was a mistake. And I think even asking the question represents real progress. The way this could go is that, again, the technological possibilities, the possibilities for rapid technological progress are very substantial. The progress we need in nuclear power is to make it cheaper in terms of capital. What happened was we built a whole bunch of plants that were designed to be very efficient in their use of the fuel, uranium, which is cheap and in abundant supply, but they were very inefficient in their use of capital. So these plants were massively expensive and difficult to maintain, and produced in this one-off kind of fashion that tried to tweak the efficiency of the thermodynamics of the energy, but made them unreliable and unaffordable. The path forward is this concept of modular nuclear reactors that are smaller, that are produced in standardized units, kind of the way we produce like ships or cars in the past. You get the benefits of learning as you produce the same thing over and over again. And we could substantially reduce the cost of nuclear, of energy, of electricity for nuclear power if we go down this path of the modular reactors. The costs of the storage of the waste are really trivial compared to the costs we're looking at in terms of mitigating the damage from carbon in the atmosphere. So it just seems like this is the way to go. The United States has been investing at the level of the government in modular nuclear reactors. The private sector has been following along and doing some work here as well. China is the other big potential player here. China will probably be the place that will build the most nuclear reactors in the coming century than compared to any other country. And so it's likely to be a force in this area as well. And I think it could be a force for global good. We really need to go down the learning curve of figuring out how to make nuclear reactors that are affordable. And safety now, if you're not trying to tweak the efficiency to make them burn the uranium at the highest possible efficiency, safety is really easy to manage in these new reactors. So I'm hopeful that what will come out of this shock is some more rational analysis of the costs and benefits of the ways that we decarbonize our fuel supply. But public opinion is in flux. Now, a second reaction, I think to Professor Ben-Ami, I think I think it's in the interests of the West to weaken Russia as much as possible. And I'm not convinced that the right idea is to try and re-engage on some strategy of mutual coexistence. It's really been damaging for the world to sort of pursue this path of, say, coexistence and cooperation, because it led to all of the reliance on Russian gas, which is now a real political and economic threat in Europe. And I think everyone needs to conclude that Russia is a very dangerous force going forward. If they do, they'll want to weaken Russia. I do agree in the sense that we don't want to see a catastrophic defeat of Russia, but we want to see Russia weaker. The best way to weaken Russia is to let people leave. And the kind of thing that will make people leave is a vibrant, free, democratic market economy in Ukraine, right next door. Russia's not threatened by NATO troops in Ukraine. There was never any prospect of NATO troops in Ukraine, and there aren't going to be NATO troops in Ukraine, most likely. But Russia is threatened by the prospect that the Ukraine shows you can have a democracy, you can have freedom, you can have rule of law, you can have prosperity. This is a terrible threat to Russia, and I think it's a threat we want to invest in and pursue. But we have to expect that Putin is going to continue to see it as a threat. So any kind of resolution of open military hostilities is going to transform into an attempt by Putin to undermine any democratic system that is an incipient democratic system that's emerging in the Ukraine. Think back to, I forget whose comments it was, I think Professor Shore's about, or maybe it was Professor Hicks, about the Russians, kind of participation in the Italian political system. I think you have to expect that Russia's going to invest enormous resources in trying to destabilize any incipient democracy in Ukraine. And the reality that we're seeing right now is it's not that hard to destabilize a democracy. So the real challenge, I think, now shifting a little bit to my own remarks, the real challenge in recovery in Ukraine is, can they build a government which is strong enough to do its job? We've had, 50 years or more of kind of ideology about the government is the problem, too much government. I mean, this is my professors at the University of Chicago who are pushing this line, but it's just catastrophically wrong to say that, you're always better off if the government is weaker. We need governments that can do their job, protect people from crime, protect them from external threats, deal with environmental problems. So we need governments that are strong enough to do their job. It's very hard to have a government which is both strong enough and yet held in check by the elections, by a system of democratic accountability. Ukraine was not very far along in that process of having a strong, effective government together with strong democratic accountability before this war came. The war has as you typically see, has created nationalistic responses that have helped support strengthening of the government, and at least in military action, it's actually performed much better than I think most people expected. We don't know exactly how this is going to transform into an effective government that can, for example, deal with systemic corruption or keep oligarchs in checks, possibly oligarchs, kind of funded and created by the Russian government. So it's a real question about whether strength in, managing a military contest is going to transition into strength in terms of creating a free, safe market economy. I think the West can be helpful and supportive in this process. But I think the hard thing we'll have to deal with is, for example, suppose it looks like Ukraine is emerging as a political system akin to Singapore in its early years, that many Westerners viewed as not truly democratic. It didn't have transitions in control by different parties, but yet it's led by people who are effective, and the government does its job. Are we going to try and undermine that kind of government because it doesn't live up to our democratic ideals? Now, what if it's a Singapore-like government, but led by people who are not, well motivated? Then it's an even more worrisome kind of concern. Perhaps even, co-opted by Russia. The political developments of Ukraine is, I think, going to be very difficult. It's quite likely that it could tip off in good or bad directions. And I think it's very hard to know how outsiders can participate in a way which is genuinely helpful, but isn't seen as being like a mirror image of malevolent influence by Russia. I wish I had the same confidence about our ability to innovate politically that I have about our ability to innovate technically, like we can with nuclear power. But I think it's a time where we need to think about some innovations in terms of political innovation. And one thing we've really never seriously explored is the idea of exports of government services. Imagine the government of Ukraine went to, the government of Canada and said, Canada, could you have the Mounties come run the police force for this city? And you go to, the French and say, could you have your gendarme run the police in this city? Or you go to the Privy Council in the UK and say, could you be, at least for this time period, the court of final appeal for our judicial system, the way the Privy Council does for a few countries left over from the Commonwealth? Could you be the court of final appeal that gives some credibility to judicial independence as it's emerging in Ukraine? I've even talked in the past about more extreme measures, which would be kind of like a regional area that could develop the way Hong Kong did, where an external power was responsible for everything within that area. I don't think that's realistic in Ukraine. I don't think it should be off the table for discussion. Some kind of a temporary arrangement where somebody runs the police, manages the courts, and so forth. But I think it probably isn't the best way forward. Probably not something the Ukrainians will like. But we shouldn't rule out the possibility of other forms of imports of government services at a time when the local government is weak and really needs some help. So to conclude, the optimism behind my story about a crisis is a terrible thing to waste is that there's enormous potential to do the things we're doing better. We kind of know how to organize our systems to do technical innovation. It's a lot tougher to do political innovation, but political innovation may be the greatest need at the moment as we figure out how to emerge from this true crisis. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Paul. We really appreciate your comments and your coming to the meeting today. Last but not least, Jim has spent many, many years in this region, has probably better knowledge than any of us of the culture and the history of this region, and most importantly, of the collective memory. And it's very interesting to me to see how a lot of items on collective memory, such as the Holocaust and the history of Ukraine and the history of Russia, all of a sudden emerge as critical in the debate. And it's somewhat fascinating to see how little this new generation of those who talk about it know about all of these histories. So my question to Jim is twofold. One, can you ever erase a memory of such a horrible conflict? And two, what kind of memories do you develop that allow people to kind of live beyond these catastrophic events? We do have some examples of the Germans and the Israeli governments figuring out an interesting way out of this mess, but the floor is yours, Jim.
Okay, thanks very much. These are great presentations. I got a lot of notes here because I learned a lot of things today. So thanks very much to everybody else. So I'm going to be very brief here and just pick up on how I think of these things. And I'd like to then kind of circle back to Professor Ben-Ami and Professor Romer with some of the things they're saying in particular. But my take on a lot of things going on in Russia these days, as it has for a long time, it depends very much on national narratives. And this doesn't mean just narratives about specific events, but underlying narrative schemata, or what I call narrative templates. Basically, the narrative template of always being under threat from an external enemy has been around for centuries. It includes the fear, as Professor Romer talks about. It's not just an invading army, although they have plenty of episodes to point to, but it's the fear of alien ideas. And you can see this, for example, in Dostoevsky's novel, Demons. Just the very notion of demons, Besi in Russian. What they really feared were demons, socialism, capitalism, nihilism. That was going to destroy Russia. They weren't, no big issue there, but it's all about threats of ideas and the isms, so to speak, as sometimes called. And the way I think about these is, in Russia's case, there are two major kinds of national narratives. And if you understand these, you can make a lot of sense of Putin's thinking and actions. Doesn't mean you have to agree with them, obviously, but if you don't understand them, you don't know how to counter them. So one of these is what I'd call the expulsion of alien enemies narrative template. This is a template that's been played out again and again. The Mongols, the French, the Germans, the Teutonic Knights, you name it, the French, the Germans again, and now NATO, but there's always a threat. Now, these are real historical episodes. We shouldn't doubt that for a second, but it's turned into this kind of narrative template that guides Russian culture. It's turned into a set of mental habits. And habits mean these are unconscious. They're very hard to break. And we don't even know if we have our own habits, but they have theirs, that they're even using them. They're saying, I'm not talking about my attitude. I'm just telling you what really happened. Those fascists in Ukraine are going to attack us. They're going to attack our people, that is Russian ethnic in this case. That's the original excuse for need to invade into Ukraine. The other national narrative, though, that's at play, and I think you see this a lot in Putin's work over the last year, is the notion that Russia has a grand historical mission to fulfill for humankind. Again, this is a very old notion, the notion of Moscow as a third Rome. Every Russian knows that expression. Very few of us do. It means Rome failed out of corruption, venality, then moved to the center of Christianity, moved to Constantinople. It again failed. It finally came to Rome. And now this is the center of pure Christian culture in the world. And Russia has a mission to preserve this, not just in the local territory, but on behalf of Christianity or traditional values for the whole world. Again, fear of isms, democracy, socialism, communism. Communism is an enemy from this perspective, by the way. So this is an underlying Russian kind of mentality in the form of national narratives. But just to go back to a couple things here. First of all, these national narrative templates are very slow to change. So that's the pessimistic side of things. they take centuries. You can see them at work for centuries. And they work for Stalin, they work for Lenin in a lot of ways, and they're really working for Putin now. So they're very hard to change. But I think going to something that Professor Romer said, one of the best bets that we have, it's not super shiny, but maybe it'll work, is we have to continue while we are really resisting Putin and Russian forces here to provide some way for the counter intellectual forces in Russia to continue to survive. That might mean having them welcome them to the West, working with them. And a lot of you have been through these exercises with Eastern Europe for decades now, but we might need to take on something like a Marshall Plan for training the next generation. And it also means something that will be very threatening to Russia, namely setting up an effective democratic model in Ukraine. That's the most threatening thing. I agree with that, even more than the HIMARS and everything else. That's the real threat, because that could destroy Russian civilization, which is what the expulsion of alien enemies is always all about. It almost destroyed Russian civilization, but the Russian people now, the Russian ethnic people, rose up and kicked it out. I think going back to some of the things we started out with, Professor Ben-Ami, I think some of the ideas there, that respect, not trust, makes a lot of sense here, but to respect, we need to understand what we're respecting. And it doesn't mean you have to agree with it again, but it does mean we have to understand what drives Putin and Russia. And we've been totally flummoxed by this for the past year. People kept asking, what does Putin want? What is he driving at? If you don't understand this grand mission narrative, which is very deeply embedded, if you don't understand its absolute knee-jerk reaction, habitual fear of alien enemies, you can't understand why he would go ahead and do these things, which seem so self-destructive. They're not self-destructive from the perspective of the narrative templates that guide Russian leaders and large segments of the population. Not all. That's decreasing every day, I think. But I think there, in that sense, that's the place where we could come at some ways of looking at long-term future after this terrible war is over. And I agree with Professor Ben-Ami. It's not good anybody's interest to humiliate Russia. You're never going to defeat it completely, but it is in the interest to change it. But you have to use Russian people to do this. They have to be part of the plan, and that's a very difficult thing to pull off. Although in Israel, for example, you have a lot of resources and a lot of people that are involved in this. So that's what I see as kind of the long-term attempt to change these very deep-seated national narratives and national memories of what could take place on an optimistic side of things with the end of the war in Ukraine, whenever that comes, and it can't come too soon, of course. So I think I'm over time a little bit. We're over the 10 o'clock time, 6 o'clock time.
You're just fine, and I'd like to thank everybody for keeping time. Itai, do you want to say anything? I can't hear you. You're muted.
Yes, I'm good now. I just want to thank, we are over time, and I do thank all of you. The remarks were great, and they do take a little longer, but we are all better off for it. So that is wonderful. Professor Mintz has asked me to thank each and every one of you for your participation. He really appreciates you coming along the table, and to mention the fact that we will have a similar meeting in about 3 to 4 months. That time I will probably, or some of us will probably be in Sciences Po in Paris, but details to come up. Thank you so much, and we will see you soon.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. See you soon, and shalom from Tel Aviv.
Thank you. Bye-bye.